That's good stuff, huh? Amen. Yeah. Hey, tell me, or give me the flag, or the flag, what do you call it? Towels. Give me the towel if you believe that you're glad, you are happy that God does not define us by our past sins. Anybody? I'm here to introduce our next speaker, and I'm really proud and happy about doing that. His name is Terrence Hunter. He has been a member of FCC in the past and is now a member of a church down in Morgan Hill, down closer where he lives. Terrence grew up without a dad. You know, I think we've heard that story already today. Grew up without a dad. In his young adulthood, he got convicted of murder, second-degree murder, and spent 30 years in prison. Here's a guy who's not defined by his past, though, because when he came out, he founded an organization called Empowering the Fatherless in order to mentor young men to give them the kinds of skills and abilities to live life unlike he was given that opportunity. And so today, really happy and proud to introduce Terrence Hunter to you. Let's give him a round of applause. Let's go. You got?
One, two, three, testing. Thank you for your warm welcome. First, I would like to express my deepest gratitude for being given the privilege of sharing my testimony with all of you here today at MANCON 2024. I would especially like to thank Pastor Matthew and FCC for giving me this opportunity. I would also like to thank my beautiful and lovely wife for her love and support and joining me today. And I would like to thank all my Christian brothers who showed up to support me for what I consider to be a monumental event. I'm going to talk to you about restoration, but by no mistake, believe that my restoration is a complete process. My restoration will be a lifelong journey, and it's one in which I welcome. My name is Terrence Hunter, and I was born on August the 15th, 1959 in Charleston, West Virginia. I was raised by my mother, and since my mother is a devout Baptist, my siblings and I were required to go to church 2 to 3 times a week. Yes, I was introduced to Jesus Christ, Christianity, and the church at a very early age. On the surface, I appeared to be your everyday kid. I played sports, I had paper routes, and I attended school regularly. I was a well-behaved kid because my mother was raising me as a Christian. However, below the surface, something different was taking place. You see, to this day, I do not know the identity of my biological father. When I was a young boy, I was sad, hurt, and disappointed that I didn't have a father. But in this country, you learn at an early age that boys are supposed to be tough. So I wasn't trying to embrace feelings of sadness and hurt and disappointment. So I started telling myself I didn't care that I was a fatherless child. Of course, everybody in this room knows that was nothing more than a coping mechanism to ignore my shame and pain. Whenever I would hear my childhood friends say, "Son, I'm taking you fishing this weekend. Son, I'm taking you on a father and son camping trip." Or, "Son, I'm taking you to a sporting event." Whenever I would hear those words, I would become very angry, bitter, and resentful. I felt that way because I didn't have a father taking me fishing, taking me camping, or to a sporting event. Well, when I was 12 years old, my mother married my stepfather. And even though he was a good man, I made no attempt to establish any sort of father and son relationship with him because at that point, I didn't think I needed a father any longer. At 12, I was all grown up. When I was 15, my stepfather and I had a disagreement, And at that very moment, I made an impulsive decision to move away from home, never to return. I wasn't some kid running away from home. When I left, I knew I was not coming back because that's the sort of kid I was. So I completed my 10th, 11th, and 12th grade years of high school living alone. Unlike a lot of kids who leave home early, quitting school wasn't even an option for me because I wasn't someone who felt like I was being forced to go to school. I enjoyed school. Unfortunately, finishing high school was the only positive thing I did after leaving home because I abandoned the church, I abandoned Christianity, and I abandoned my family. I was so angry when I left home. I've never been to a family reunion since I was 15 years old. I've never been to my mother's home for a Thanksgiving, Christmas dinner, or any other festive event. That's how angry I was. And I started keeping company with guys that I would categorize as street thugs. I was a 15-year-old kid hanging out with men in their 20s and 30s, and these men carried switchblades and firearms, and they had a very low tolerance for disrespect. These men taught me if someone disrespected me, shooting or stabbing them was justified. And so I took on their mentality. Why was I attracted to these men specifically? Well, these men always had money, they dressed well, and they drove expensive cars, and they were always surrounded by beautiful women. So I took on their mentality, I took on their value system, and whenever I ventured into areas like East-West Oakland, the Fillmore District, the Tenderloin in San Francisco, or neighborhoods in Richmond, I carried a 12-gauge riot pump shotgun and a 9mm Beretta, and I wasn't carrying it for show. I wish a gang member or a drug dealer would have stepped to me wrong because I wouldn't have said anything. I would have let my guns do all the talking. I used to refer to my weapons as my American Express card because I didn't leave home without them. I was living a very reckless lifestyle, and it was just a matter of time before I would find myself on the wrong side of the law. I was playing football in San Francisco in 1985, and I received a pretty bad hit that tore my anterior cruciate ligament and my meniscus, and I had to undergo a knee reconstruction. Upon being released from the hospital, I had a full leg brace that went from my hip all the way down to my ankle, and it had metal to where I had to walk with a stiff leg. A couple of days after my return from the hospital, my living girlfriend accused me of being unfaithful, having sexual relations with other women. And what startled me about her accusations is that she has specific information about my activities, which she shouldn't have had because when I was doing what I was doing, she was at work. It occurred to me that there was only one person who could have told her what I was doing, and that was my weightlifting partner. We both weighed about 250. We could both bench over 400. We could both squat over 500, and we could deadlift more than 600. So I was in no condition to engage in physical combat with him, so I shot him twice with my 12-gauge shotgun and killed him. I was convicted of second-degree murder, and I received a 17 years to life prison sentence. After my introduction to the California prison system at the age of 25, they sent me to the most violent prison they had, which was Folsom State Prison. And for those of you who may not understand this, when I went to prison in 1985, California only had 7 prisons. When you committed murder, you was either going to Folsom or San Quentin, which were level 5 maximum security prisons. I landed at Old Folsom, and I discovered why it was such a violent prison. Yet approximately 5,000 of us serving time there, and practically all of us were serving time for murder. In that population, we had the Black Guerrilla family, we had the 415, we had the Mexican Mafia, we had the Texas Syndicate, we had Serranos, Norteños, and we had Bulldogs. So I'm sure nobody in this room has any difficulty in believing how violent of a place that was. Riots, stabbings, killings, shootings were the order of the day. So I remained violent. Whenever I had a conflict with a fellow prisoner, I resolved that conflict with violence. And this went on for my first probably 11, 12 years of incarceration. Then one day I was at San Quentin, and I took a look at myself, and for the first time in my life, I admitted I was a very violent person. Because up until that point, I didn't see myself as violent. I seen myself as someone who did what I had to do. And I wasn't assaulting law-abiding citizens. The people I assaulted were people in the life. So I felt justified when I hurt them or stabbed them or even killed them. I asked myself a question. How did a well-behaved kid who was raised in the church become a murderer and do the other detestable things I've done in my life when it comes to violence? Because I always blamed the victim. Always said to myself, well, if they hadn't done what they did, or if they hadn't said what they said, I wouldn't have done what I did. So to answer this question, I enrolled in a program known as the Alternatives to Violence Project, better known as AVP. Like I said, I was at San Quentin at the time, and AVP is a 21-hour, 3-day workshop in which I was required to interact with Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian prisoners. Now, this was new because I entered the system, and it was a very racially charged system at the time, to where all I interacted with was other Black guys. Same with Mexicans, Asians, whites. No one interacted with people of the other race, and you could get killed for that. Now, all of a sudden, I was in a program that addresses violence, that I was interacting with people of different races. Because I did the work, I was able to make the connection between my internal anger and how I felt about never having a dad. For years, I told myself I didn't care that I didn't have a father, but now I had to face the truth that that was what was causing me to behave the way I did. It had nothing to do with what people said to me or did to me. It was what was going on inside of me. And once I understood that, I was no longer angry. My experience in the AVP Basic Workshop was such a rewarding experience. I completed the Advanced and Training for Trainer workshops, and I became an AVP facilitator. Here I was facilitating conflict resolution programs, and what happened is fellow prisoners would come to me because they knew the work I did, and if they had a problem with an individual or a certain gang, they would come to me and make me aware of it, and I went from being an agitator and an instigator to being a mediator. I would find myself stopping violence. And I discovered something. People in society think that men in prison love doing the violence that we do. And that's not really the catalyst. If you're running with a certain clique, you have no choice but to do what we do in there when we call blasting people and doing the things we do, because if you don't react in a certain way, you make your clique look weak. And so what I discovered, when they could come to me and say, can you help me with this situation? They could go back to their clique and say, hey, I was going to stab that fool, but, T stepped in and he went and took care of it. So they could use me as the reason why they didn't resort to violence. This changed my image of myself because there's power in that. When you can stop men from being violent, there's power in that. And so what happened is my self-image changed. And one day I was on San Quentin's lower yard, and one of my friends mentioned a program known as Kairos. Kairos is a self-help group that's faith-based. You have a group of Christian men, about 29 to 30 of them, come inside San Quentin, and they spend 3 days with us. So on the very first day, we met in the Protestant chapel, and we were divided in groups where there were several prisoners seated at tables with several of these Christian men. And when I sat down at my table, the man in charge said, we're going to go around the table, introduce, and tell the group something about ourselves. Well, through self-talk, I said, I'm not telling them anything. I wasn't into sharing information. However, when the other men started disclosing very intimate information about themselves, I felt obligated to do the same. So I told them my name. I told them I had a poor relation with my stepfather that caused me to leave home at an early age. And I killed a friend in 1985, and I was serving a 17 years to life prison sentence. When I finished speaking, there was a white guy seated to my right. And he turned to me and he said, poor relationships with fathers is not limited to stepfathers. And he began to tell us what a horrible relationship he had with his biological father and how abusive his father was to him and his mother. As this man was telling his story, tears were streaming down his face. And this caught my attention because I was in my late 30s, and it marked the very first time I ever saw a man cry. In the circles I ran in, real men don't cry. And this man was crying with no sense of shame, wasn't trying to hold back the tears, he just let them flow. Well, that morning when we took our very first break, this man approached me and he says, I feel like there's a connection between you and I. If I write you, will you write me back? And I paused because at that time I wasn't writing anyone, including my family. And for some strange reason, in a very nonchalant manner, I said, sure, if you write me, I'll write back. This man's name is Bruce Hodgen. At the end of the 3-day workshop, members in the community who were members of Kairos were permitted to spend the last night with us. And so I had the opportunity to meet his wife, Connie. And they befriended me, but they could not visit me because volunteers who come into a certain institution are not permitted to visit inmates at the same institution. The authorities have the fear that we may manipulate them and get them to bring contraband into the prison. However, when I transferred to the central facility in Soledad, they immediately filled out visiting forms and started visiting me. I would learn that Bruce is a real estate agent, broker, and land developer, and him and his wife live in Saratoga, California. They started visiting me on weekends, on holidays, on my birthday. So they were driving from Saratoga to Soledad, which is a round trip of 180 miles. It shocked me that they were willing to travel that distance to come and visit me. After all, I was an outcast, I was a murderer, I'd been removed from society. This family, after visiting me for a few years, their brother and sister-in-laws started visiting me. And all of a sudden, the greeting cards I received from them changed. They would send me greeting cards that would say, "Happy birthday, son." "Merry Christmas, son." "Happy Thanksgiving, son." And these were Italian people who received me into their family. Now imagine that, an Italian family embracing an African-American man who's serving time for murder. I didn't see that one coming. And so they were showering me with unconditional agape love, and it changed my heart. My family wasn't even loving me in such a manner. I was thinking one day about what this family did for me. They were sending me care packages with food, clothing, and cosmetics. They would send me funds where I could go and spend whatever I want to spend on food sales. They were writing me on a regular basis, and they accepted all of my collect phone calls. When I would call the husband and wife, we would be talking, and the phone calls were limited to 15 minutes. And somebody would come on the phone and say, your time is up in 1 minute. And they would say, can you call back? And sometimes I would call back 2 or 3 times because they weren't finished with the conversation. I would hate to see what their phone bills looked like. And so what happened, I had a spiritual awakening in prison. I could feel the Holy Ghost presence in my life, and I became conscious of God's love, protection, and guidance that he had given me all my life. When I reflected on my life, I could see all the moments where I could have lost my life, and I didn't. And it had to be his protection, both prior to incarceration and during my incarceration. I served 30 years in prison. I saw many of my friends killed, stabbed, shot during riots. I never suffered a scratch. I used to brag and boast. I'd go to the shower, and a lot of those men have battle wounds all over them where they've survived the violence that takes place in prison. Many, you can just look at the rough life they lived. And I used to go in the shower and say, you guys need to make note of something. I don't have any battle wounds on me. I have all my teeth. I have no battle wounds on my face. And so I used to contribute that to my ability to take care of myself. I was a strong guy. I fought well. But when I came into this sense of enlightenment during that spiritual awakening, I realized that the fact that I've never suffered any injury in prison had absolutely nothing to do with me and everything to do with him. It occurred to me that God had had his hand on me all my life, and it brings to mind Jeremiah 29:11. For I have plans for you, declared the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And it was obvious to me that God had bigger plans for me and that he needed to put me in the situation I was in to shape and mold me into the man that he wanted me to become. I remember making a conscious decision that for the rest of my time in prison, I would not concern myself with when I'm going home. I would leave that to God. I was convinced that when it was time for me to go home, he would open the gates. I no longer gave the power to the parole board as if they had my life in their hand. I said, God is the God that can open doors no man can close and close doors that no man can open. Instead, I decided I would be prepared for when they released me, regardless of when that would be. And so I started participating in the positive things taking place in prison. I joined a data processing vocational trade in which I became a specialist at using Microsoft software. I have certification from Microsoft itself. I joined a computer refurbishing program where I learned to build desktop computers. We were funded by a company known as Detweiler. They bought all the computer cases, motherboards, and components we need to build computers. And K-12 schools in California that could not afford computers would contact Detweiler, and they would say they need 100 systems or 200 systems. And I was in a shop in which we had 75 technicians, in which I was the lead technician. And they would say we need X amount of systems, and me and my guys would build those systems in a day and load the appropriate software. If you came inside of my shop, which is probably 1.5 times the size of this room, if you looked around the crown molding, you would see cards from one end to the other. And these were cards from kids that thanked us for their beautiful computers. At the time in which they shut down our shop, we had donated more than 25,000 computers to K-12 schools. And I used to wonder how many kids have access to each one of those systems and try to figure out how many lives we impacted. In 2006, me and 30 prisoners started a Toastmasters International Club at Soledad. When I was released from prison, by the way, I went in the system on February the 25th of 1985, and they released me on December the 4th, 2014, after 30 years of serving time. 2 months after I left prison, I went to my first Toastmasters Club, which was a Silicon Valley club. told them who I am, told them I've been to prison, told them of my achievements as a Toastmaster, and they encouraged me to join the club, and they voted me in as their vice president of education. The following year, they voted me in as their president. So I'm going to conferences representing a Silicon Valley club. And then in 2017, I became Toastmasters International Area B6 Director, which means all of the clubs in Cupertino were under my leadership and guidance, including Apple and Amazon. I've had nothing but success. I published my book in 2018, and I established my nonprofit in 2019. I work with at-risk youth, fatherless youth, and I work with men, incarcerated men, teaching them how to be better fathers, better parents, and better partners to the women of their children. I came here today to share my testimony because when I was in prison taking the trades I was taking and the programs, my fellow lifer prisoners would say, I don't know why you're taking all those programs. They're not letting us out, and no one's going to hire you anyway. Well, I'm getting ready to go back into San Quentin in the Kairos program in September, and I go into Elmwood, and it's amazing the success I'm having with working with men because they can identify with me, and I can identify with them. I would like to end by saying what a very loving, forgiving God we serve, my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. He has turned my life around, and he has turned a negative into a positive. Thank you.